Well, welcome everyone. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially proud to say I'm the dean here at the University of Chicago Graham School. We are very excited to have you here to discuss the two Machiavellis with Christopher Lynch, a basic program instructor. I will just share the briefest of introductions because I know you are here to hear him and not me, that the Graham School is now 132 years into being the home of lifelong learning here at the University of Chicago. And our model is that we have open courses and opportunities to experience the University of Chicago education with eminent faculty and extraordinary instructors like Chris Lynch, who you'll hear from momentarily. And we use these conversations at Graham to preview upcoming courses in our open enrollment program. And so this particular conversation with Chris Lynch is going to be previewing his course this spring on the two Machiavellis. And so with that, I will take down our slides so you can see our speaker. And I will offer an introduction, which is only a snapshot of his truly extraordinary biography. Christopher Lynch received his bachelor's from St. John's College and his PhD from the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Carthage College and has been a visiting associate professor at the University of Chicago. We are incredibly proud, as of now, to call him a basic program instructor at the Graham School. His research concerns Machiavelli, whose Art of War he has translated. He also co-edited the collection of essays, Principle and Prudence in Western Political Thought. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but I'll mention that what he's working on and actually will be sharing with this upcoming course is a new book that he is working to edit that's going to be coming out from Oxford University Press that looks at the other Machiavelli, but now I'm getting into the subject matter. So before going any further, I should turn it over to our instructor, Chris Lynch, with the following prompt to get us started, Chris. You've shared this with me, but I think one of the things that's so interesting before we get to the two Machiavellis is the biography of Machiavelli himself, because as we were speaking in our preparatory call, I was fascinated to learn more about him, where he lived, where he grew up, and even his time in jail. And so I'm curious, just to set the table for the rest of this discussion, if you can offer us a biographical sketch of Machiavelli, and then we'll jump into this two-folded person.
Great, sure. I'm happy to. Thanks for doing this, Seth. It's great to have a supportive, knowledgeable dean like yourself doing things like this. So it's wonderful. A lot of the people here already know how great the basic program is, but I'm just thrilled to, in the last year and a half, to have become part of this team. It's a great curriculum. Machiavelli. He's well known. His name, is, when it's turned into its adjectival form, we use it, Machiavellian. There's good reason for that. It's a word that means person who's willing to use tricks and force to get his way. Machiavelli himself was not that much like that in his day-to-day life. He was, someone who had good friends and who was trusted by them. But he did have a very interesting life. He was born in 1468 in Florence, where he lived his whole life. There's a place outside Florence where he has his estates, but born at a time when the famous Medici rulers in Florence were very much in power. So Florence was technically a republic, but in fact, it was really a kind of a principality. It was really ruled by this family. When Machiavelli was around 25, there was a kind of revolution of sorts when the French came and invaded Italy. A bunch of stuff happened, including the Medici getting thrown out of power in Florence. A Republican government came in then, And 4 years after the beginning of the Republican government, Machiavelli was himself brought into government as the secretary of what's called the Second Chancery. He was in charge of foreign affairs within Florence's dominion throughout Tuscany. At first, he was, sort of a kind of a mere bureaucrat. Over the 14 years of government service, he became very, very close to the guy who becomes sort of leader for life in this republic. And in that capacity, he does many things, does lots of diplomacy, but his main thing is that he founded a militia. He basically became the Secretary of Defense of a country or a city-state that had no military. So he founded a military. And then he actually, after founding it, led it. And led it in a great foreign policy victory, not as a general on horseback in an open field battle or anything like that, but as someone who reduced a rebellious city, a city that was rebelling against Florence, back to submission to Florence by conducting a long siege operation, leading his militia. That was kind of the high point of his career, but he did many and varied things during this time. The Medici, however, come back and they throw out the Republican government and very quickly throw out Machiavelli. And very shortly after that, he is arrested for his supposed involvement, which turns out not to really have been true, in a conspiracy against the Medici. And he was imprisoned, and while in prison for about 12 days, he was tortured. There's this awful torture called the strappato, where they tie your hands behind your back and put that rope that they've tied up through a pulley on the ceiling, and they pull you up to the top of the ceiling, and then they let the rope go, and then they catch it again down at the bottom, and usually dislocated shoulders is what happens. He survived that. And while in prison, he wrote some poems that we might have occasion to talk about later. And then he got out, he was exiled for a while, and then he became the Machiavelli we end up knowing about, because that's just when he writes all of his books. Okay, and he does that all the way to 1527. The first, big book that he writes is The Prince, the one that he's most famous for. So that's his career and his life, in a nutshell, anyhow.
Well, what fascinating lived experience. I mean, horrific in some regard, but fascinating in the sense that you think about these major teachings and how life experience shapes your viewpoint. And, I've read many times to be feared, versus to be loved, but that gives a whole new context, to how you read that when you think about the torture and other experiences that he had. So thanks for getting us started with the biographical side. And now let's come to the Machiavelli that we do know across the world, the one who, is in all the terms, if you're Machiavellian or Machiavelli for women, or, the many ways that we continue to see his name and theory show up in modern society. And so, can you tell us about that Machiavelli, his core intellectual contributions, and how his work has shaped our understanding of the world to this day?
Sure. I'm at the sort of extreme end of interpreters on that last thing you mentioned, Seth. That is to say, I think that his influence has been absolutely profound. So I guess I'll start by saying that, and then I'll say how that is, as I'll kind of build up to that in talking about the well-known Machiavelli. So he's known for his teaching on sort of power politics and the use of force and fraud. And you gave the quotation that's in most mob movies. Sometimes explicitly attributed to Machiavelli, or as Tony Soprano called him, Machiavelli. And that is that, it's better if you got to choose between being loved and feared, it's better to be feared than loved. And the reason for that is because you can control people's fear of you. You can't really control their love of you. And that says a lot. It's the most famous teaching of his, and it's kind of deservedly so. It says a lot because it points to what he really is teaching in much of his political writings, and I'll just tell you the names of a couple of them in a second, is you do need to be in control of your own situation. And his phrase for that is having arms of your own, not being subject to anyone else's control, but you being in control. And in a literal sense, having arms of your own means if you're going to be a ruler, you better make sure, like he did when he was in government in Florence, you better make sure you got an actual army.
Yeah.
He features this idea in his three major works, where this is featured most prominently: The Prince, which is, as you know, read in the basic program; The Art of War, which I translated; and the Discourses on Livy. The first and last book that I just mentioned opens up a big question that we won't really get into on, was Machiavelli for monarchic government, like it seems he is in The Prince, or was he for republican government, like it seems he is in the Discourses? To me, I think that matters, but what really matters more is that he is, his core contribution throughout these works, I've already alluded to, and a way to sum it up would be to say, it's really what we would call the realistic approach to politics. That is to say, don't rely on how things ought to be. Don't try to bring it about that a moral world exists. Take things as they are. And that includes as human beings generally operate on that basis, and get control of the situation politically and in your life by knowing the necessities that really rule us. So, or thought, but then it really becomes the foundation of sort of modernity as such, because entailed in this was a real deep rejection of especially Catholic Christianity, but then also the whole classical tradition that classical Christianity had been intimately bound up with by the time Machiavelli was writing. His real aim, his ultimate aim, was to overthrow that whole way of looking at the world and to replace it with what we call a realist understanding, which doesn't quite capture it all, but that takes its bearings by how things are, not by how they ought to be.
Well, so that was a beautiful recap of the Machiavelli many of us know. And, the idea that's at the core still, and, deservedly so, is this point about control and fear being a better way to get there than love. And now we're going to move into this other Machiavelli. And I guess what's so surprising to many of us who don't study him at the level you do and know as much is, given this Machiavelli who says fear over love, there's this other Machiavelli who's a romantic, if I can, kind of begin to preview. And so tell us about this other Machiavelli, the surprise Machiavelli for many of us.
Yeah, this is the Machiavelli who all but says in some letters, and then sort of acts on this in his poetry writing, if you got to choose between love or fear, love. As in, not necessarily rely on people's love of you in life. That's not what he means. But what he means is, if you're going to preoccupy yourself with something, if you got to choose between politics and war on the one hand and love on the other, love. Now, the love you said, the only thing I'll have to correct a little bit, Seth, is you used the word romantic. It's not romantic love for the most part. I mean, he becomes enraptured with people of both sexes. He becomes obsessed with them. He writes of other people's obsession. The sexual element's very strong. The romantic element, though, this is not chivalric love by any stretch, and it's not 19th, 21st century romantic love, looking for your soulmate, who you're going to, you'll gaze into their eyes and you'll see, the person you were meant for. This is at least to begin with, in much of his writing, a lower, sometimes very bawdy. Some of his poems are downright filthy. They do it in a way that is funny. But then, for as much as that's true, what I'm saying about it not being romantic, he does have this one poem called L'Asino, the ass, which is about a guy who's captured by a maiden of Circe and is going to be turned into an ass and go through life as as a jackass. But before this happens to him, he has a intimate, deep interaction with this maiden of Circe, and that comes very close to a kind of romantic love. So he really runs the whole gamut from very low, sort of base sexual imagery and even relationships, ethereal ones, though that latter is not as common. And he does this in a whole bunch of poems. He wrote 30 poems. He 4 what I'll call stories. He wrote 2 plays. It is really another whole realm from the realm of politics, the realm of love for him. And it kind of goes along with the idea that with love, it's the private realm. War and politics, it's the public realm, and that distinction between public and private still really matters to him. But when he's in love, he doesn't care at all about politics. Politics, he looks over at it and he just thinks, this looks small. All I get is trouble when I'm in politics. Let me love on. So
I'll make a brief reference to another conversation we actually just had on the history of normality, where we heard Tal Arbol talking about the scientizing of normality over the last 200 years. And one of the things she mentioned is prior to that, there were norms in society from, for example, the church and from other sources, but we hadn't necessarily defined in a scientific way what was, right and wrong. And one of the examples she gave was actually how about 200 years ago, we began scientizing a normality of sexual orientation. And the reason I bring this up is because Machiavelli obviously is before that time. You mentioned his sexual engagement with individuals that identified in both genders. And so I'm just curious if you could, speak a little bit about what that meant at that time. I just think that we often don't recognize. I'm married to a historian, so I kind of hear a lot. But even for me, like I didn't fully recognize in some ways what I understand to be, but before the last 200 years, the sometimes greater common experience or possibility. And so I just think this is worth bringing out if you can briefly, and then we'll kind of come into how these two Machiavellis interact.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, it's quite clear to scholars now, and I'm not quite sure why it took them so long to accept this, except for maybe some of these things you're just mentioning of, criteria of normality. But it's pretty well accepted that Machiavelli was bisexual, and it hits you over the head as you're reading some of his letters. And in fact, they're really kind of almost on the very question you just asked, Seth, because he's reflecting on sexual norms and doing it in his usual mischievous way. In this one exchange of letters he has with a friend, there's it turns out really there are 2 friends. One's gay and one's straight, and they each are complaining about the other, and complaining about the sexual practices of the other. And Machiavelli, whole scenario where he would sort of deny each of them the sexual practices that they have, and he pictures himself coming into a room when they're sitting around together and they're miserable because neither of them has what they want. And Machiavelli imagines himself coming into the room, and he looks around and he says, "What kind of flipping house," using a different word, "what kind of a flipping house is this? There are no women, there are no boys. This is gonna drive you absolutely crazy. I couldn't live here." He goes on then to reflect on norms, and he sees them going both ways. He's like, if you are either kind of monosexuality, if it's moralistic, he doesn't have anything to do with it. If it's gays who are against being straight, if it's straights who are against being gay? He's like, no, try and see the whole picture and do like I do, he says, go with the beautiful and with the loves that attract you, and don't allow these social norms, which he calls madness. He just uses the word patsy. It's just, they're crazy to be this way. So yeah, that's sort of a picture into it. I mean, I could tell you about what we know about his individual practices, but it's all pretty speculative.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And then it took the rest of society, I think, a few hundred years to realize it's madness, but the Supreme Court finally helped us to get to that recognition. So he was early on that understanding. There are two Machiavellis. How do they interact? How do you see the love-oriented Machiavelli show up in political philosophy? How do you see in the writings, that we don't know as well, maybe even these views from the public sphere coming in? Is there an interaction between the two that you see as someone who knows his writing so well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is, and it really is, to me. I wouldn't have said this if you'd asked me about this, I don't know, 15 years ago. But to me, it's actually the single most important thing about his body of work as a whole. That is the interaction between these two Machiavellis. So, on the one hand, within each of these realms, things operate kind of similarly. That is, it's all kind of about power and control and getting what you want in war and politics, but it's also about kind of power, control, getting what you want. So in a way you could say, oh, well, it's just the same guy in two different areas. But as I said before, when he's in one realm, he looks over to the other and he says, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Not only that, so they really are like, sort of mutually exclusive realms of his soul or of the nature of things, or however you want to put it. But not only that, there is just an amazing letter that he wrote a little bit after being exiled to a good friend of his. And they had an exchange. Usually they write about politics more often than not, but sometimes they write about love. And they had been doing that in recent letters. And Machiavelli writes to this friend, Francesco Vittori, he says, if someone were to read our letters, they would not know what to make of us. And they would probably reprove us. They would blame us because on the one hand, we're talking about these grave matters, and uses this word grave in the sense of heavy, these heavy matters, war and politics. But then when they go to another letter, they'll see us as this opposite of grave, with these very light matters of love. And they may think that, that really is blamable to when we have this gravitas about us that we just flip to the other side. And he says, but they're wrong to do that. He says, because when we do that, we are, and then this is the key phrase, we are imitating nature, which is variable. Nature varies. And in doing this, we are imitating nature. And he says, no one can blame someone when it comes to imitating nature. And he doesn't then use the word, and that's what makes me happy, and not just happy in the sense of content, but that's why I actually am happy. I'm living according to nature in this alternation. And as you look into this a little bit more, it's not just he's not just saying the nature of things is to vary. Stuff just changes one thing after another. So let's change one thing after another. No, it varies like a pendulum. It goes back and forth between what seem to be, sort of set, like I was saying before, realms of existence. And he's going back and forth between them, just like the straight gay thing. You want to see the whole picture. You want to experience the whole picture. Same with love versus, on the one hand, versus war and politics on the other. You want to actually be inside of each realm and see the world from the other realm and go back and forth. Now, who the person is that goes back and forth, is there one Machiavelli above these two? Seems like there is, but for now I'm thinking of them as two Machiavellis.
Well, I have to share that, we talk constantly at the Graham School about how much insight there is in the great books, how much timeless wisdom And, you hear a phrase like that, which I had not heard before, in terms of how this pendulum imitates nature, how we can be variable, how we can, code switch, however we want to kind of frame out that idea that we can have this kind of identity that is the Sirius and then another. It's amazing to, have that identified at this point in time. And yet still today we're coming to terms with these understandings. So just really powerful insight. I want to let our audience know we are coming to Q&A that you're asking. So I have one final question, and then you are taking us the rest of the way. I say to the 76 other members of this virtual room. So chat in your questions as you have them, or let me know if you'd like to ask them directly, and I can come and unmute you. Final question before we turn it over, Chris, is you're teaching this class. This is a preview. Tell us about, the approach of that course and what's on your reading list. And, just in case you don't mention it, I'll embarrass you that you're editing a book of the writings of the other Machiavelli that is being published by Oxford. And, as I understand it, you're going to be reading some of those in this class. And so it's a really special opportunity for people to see writing that, many people in this world have not seen yet by Machiavelli.
Yes, that last thing is it's going to be a translation of all of Machiavelli's poems and stories. I'm doing it with Nathan Tarkoff, who's professor at the Committee on Social Thought. We're going to be using a lot of that as we go. So, but the way the course is organized, we're going to start off with kind of like we did in this conversation, actually. We'll start off with the familiar Machiavelli. We'll reread The Prince for those who haven't read it. It'll be for the first time. And then we'll read one of his stories, which is a fictional biography of a great mercenary captain who takes over government and then starts a small empire. And it's almost a big empire, where we kind of see Machiavelli's famous teachings put into, sort of brought to life by this guy, Castruccio. 3 weeks on the familiar Machiavelli, even though some of that will be with a unfamiliar text, because this life of Castruccio is not that much read, and that's one of the works that'll be in this translation that Nathan Tarkoff and I are doing. After that, then we'll spend 7 weeks on the other Machiavelli. We'll read 2 plays, one of which is very famous, the Mandragola. The other's not so well known, and then we'll go from there to his poetry, much of which indicated devoted to matters of love, but some of which kind of pick up his big concepts, the concept of fortune, concept of ingratitude, and a number of other ideas like that, ambition. So we'll read these poems, and then we'll kind of end with some of his letters. And in fact, that exchange I was telling you about, we'll read that because it's back and forth between him and a friend. And there's a lot of humor between them on this, but then at the same time, mixed in these sort of profound reflections on his as a writer of literature and a writer of history and political philosophy too. So that's basically how the course will go.
So we have our first question from George William. Was Machiavelli considered amoral?
On his good days, I think amoral. On his bad days, immoral. I think that if I had to choose between those two, I guess I'd go with amoral in my own view. But at his time, while he was alive and some of his writings were circulating, he wasn't quite known as either of those things, but he was known as having what his friends refer to his own philosophy. They refer to his philosophy without identifying what it is. And, he's more sort of thought of as a shrewd advisor to princes, whether Republican or princely. And then afterwards, he was known as the prince, and the courses were published. He was put on, his books were put on the papal index of books you may not read. This was considered, very immoral. If I had to choose, I'd say, yeah, more amoral, because what he's really trying to do is sort of look through moral things to get a kind of trans moral perspective and really get at what the nature of things are. Yeah, I'd have to say, short answer, yes, he was considered that.
Robert Augusto Riva asked, last time you spoke, you touched briefly on, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Boccaccio. Can you speak more on the relationship between Boccaccio and Machiavelli, or the influence of Boccaccio on Machiavelli?
Yeah, no, it's definitely big. You can see echoes of Boccaccio, throughout, especially Machiavelli's writings on having to do with love. And in fact, one 20th century interpreter of Machiavelli said that what Boccaccio did in the realm of love, Machiavelli did in the realm of politics and war. And what I assume that he meant by that, and that I would kind of agree with, is that both of them really were engaged in critiquing the reigning understanding of things, especially as put forward by the Catholic Church, and trying to sort of bring people into touch with their sort of more natural and more selfish desires, and then try to have organized life in a sort of pleasant way around those desires, rather than trying to sort of repress those desires and keep them down. So, but then in particular, Boccaccio, I mean, he even quotes Boccaccio at a couple points. And one of his favorite quotations is that Boccaccio says that Machiavelli adopts and adapts a little bit, is, better to do and repent than not to do and repent. By which he means, if you're thinking of making some, questionable sexual play or not doing it, do it. You may regret it afterwards, but that's better than not doing it and regretting that you didn't do it. So this is a Boccaccioism that he picked up and used, and sums up a lot of both of their thinking.
Sonja Fox asked, how would you rank Putin as Machiavelli? And I'll maybe just extend that by saying, we're in a deeply unsettling moment in the world. Yeah. We have watched a humanitarian crisis result from Putin's invasion of a sovereign nation. And, in many ways, when you think about the lessons of Machiavelli, they almost give, a quote unquote rationale. Obviously, it's a horrific event that has no rationale, but how do you think about that, and how does that, and I know this may be beyond just the historian or political scientist, but how does that lead us to kind of reflect on Machiavelli from the standpoint of, are there harms or dangers that come out of announcing and kind of, but by announcing, almost making some aspects of these self-fulfilling, in the sense that, once it's announced that this is the world order, then, you get more of these heinous actions. I'm curious kind of to take Sonja's question, but then almost broaden it for you, and how we think about, that legacy almost of these moral thoughts, or amoral or immoral thoughts, and how we think about them.
Yeah, I mean, up until 10 days ago, I would have said, at a low level, Putin is a pretty good Machiavellian. That is to say, he's a shrewd ruler who uses force and fraud, deception, in ways that are very much to his advantage, of keeping him in power and enhancing his status and the status of his country. I'm not saying that things are great in Russia, or that that I'm endorsing what he's saying, what he's done. But I am saying that, if you kind of take low-level Machiavellian machinations, he's pretty good. He seems to have really miscalculated in this case. So that might require a reevaluation of, just how effective at this low-level Machiavellianism he was before as well. How much did he rely on luck? up till now. But the other thing I'd say, though, is that Putins have existed, since human beings have been human beings, since before Machiavelli started writing. And, so on the one hand, we can't say, well, the writings of Machiavelli lead to Putin's because Putin's predate Machiavelli. On the other hand, and then this goes beyond Putin because, well, I guess even before I do that other hand, I'll say on a high level, Putin is not at all Machiavelli. So at a high level, what Machiavelli is about is rulers who are truly great. He's interested in Moses. He's as a founder of a whole way of life. He's interested in Romulus as a founder of, pre-founder of Rome as a whole way of life. He's not really interested in what is in effect, even though Russia's vast, a petty tyrant, getting his petty way. So he would actually kind of look down ultimately on a Putin, and not for being too ambitious, but for not being ambitious enough, not for thinking of what would really be a genuinely good and great thing for Russia and for his neighbors, and how could he bring that about? He's not even in that ballpark. That said, though, so we can't blame Machiavelli or Putin on Machiavelli, but can we blame other things even worse on Machiavelli? Maybe. Sort of the really hugely ambitious predecessor of Putin, the Soviet Empire, and the huge dreams of communism and the many horrors that were brought about with Stalin and others. Maybe that because Machiavelli really did want to say, get rid of those old-fashioned norms, make them go away, replace them with this calculus of power and ambition of human beings seizing control and changing the world. Some pretty awful things were that banner. So maybe in that really big way, we could say, yeah, there's some danger to doing what he did.
Melissa Ray says, you have mentioned that there may have been a Machiavelli above the two. Would you say more about this possibility, please? Where do you find this Machiavelli above? And how does he interact, as it were, with each of the two Machiavellis? We're now in the three. I feel like, this is a very multi-personality analysis.
Yeah, good. No, that's great. That's I like that question a lot. This gets us into, speculation because he says so little, but one cannot help but, ask that question when he's saying, someone would look at us switching back and forth, look at him and his friend, Francesco Vittori, and, they might blame us, but we are, he says, even though there are these, two different realms and one looks meaningless from the perspective of the other, we are the self-same individuals in each of these realms. So he is asserting his identity as one right when it comes into question of, well, are you two or are you one? He's like, we're the self-same people, even though we're completely different in these two different realms. And so then, this question about, well, what holds them together? What is that? At one point, when he's talking about this, he says the same thing at the end of his other great work that I didn't mention. He wrote 4, long prose works, with the Prince as the shortest, but the longest is the Florentine Histories. And at the end of the Florentine Histories, he characterizes Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a great patron of the arts and one of these Medici rulers of Florence. And he says that he too, you'd be amazed, you'd be full of wonder to see him going from playing like a goofball with his kids on the floor and being engaged in all sorts of love affairs on the one hand, to on the other being the big power politician of Italy. But the word that comes up that he attributes to him, which seems to clearly fall on the power side, but maybe is the mediating side, is the mediating third Machiavelli. He used the word prudence. So it seems like maybe what Machiavelli is, and maybe what human beings are, is kind of similar to how the ancients thought. That is to say, or like Aristotle, our cognitive capacity, our ability to, sort of see these realms and hover over them in thought, even while existentially, we at any moment we must choose. We're in one or the other. So that would be an initial response, I guess, that my basic thought is it's his mind, it's his intellect that transcends the very bodily realm that he calls us into in each of those two realms.
So Dana asks, how did the experience of imprisonment and torture influence Machiavelli's work and outlook? Do you see evidence of its impact in his work or no?
Oh, I think, I don't see any evidence of it, like it was a trauma that, recurred or that he, that really affected him, that he referred back to, that he seems to have been scarred by or something like that. I don't see evidence of that. I don't know how I would find it if it were. I mean, he could just say stuff like that in his letters, so he does not. But that was a, major event in his life, I think, really has to be the case because it went hand in hand. It wasn't at the exact same time. There were a couple months in between, but, it went hand in hand with him being thrown out of government, being thrown, in effect, forced out of the practical world into the theoretical world that he then ends up flourishing in. But, it's the end of Republican government and the reinstitution of a princely government that was less free and less favorable to, sort of human flourishing. And it was an extremely painful thing. So it had to have been a big deal, but I don't see evidence that it was, it's kind of a reference point. He comes back to that moment in Florentine history often. And it's a divide between those two big parts of his political military thought that I mentioned before. Is he for princely government or is he for Republican government? It's on the cusp of that. But so he's playing around it, but I can't really speak to, and I wouldn't quite trust any biographer who tried to say, oh, well, it had a big impact and here's how. So I don't know what they'd be basing it on. I think I know the evidence and I don't know what I could really say.
We have a question about his relationship to the church as an important source of power. And curious for your thoughts there. Obviously, the church is a huge, engine of power at this time in this place.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just, you can't, how much it was a power, and not just throughout the Western world, which it was, but we got to remember where Machiavelli was when he was there. Not only was he present in Rome when one of the most impressive popes of the era, Julius II, became pope during the conclave. He was there. He knew all that was going on. But not only that, there were two different, and at his time, this one, Medici ruler was the pope. Okay, so a Medici prince became pope. Now, he wasn't technically prince. He was just a citizen of Florence, but he was of the ruling family of Florence, and he became pope. So the Medici, he was doubly, to speak the way he speaks, Florence was doubly under the house of the Medici, once as secular rulers of their city and another time as papal rulers. He thought that the papacy was a political disaster. It messed up politics to no end. Popes were strong enough to bring in outside powers and not strong enough to get rid of them. So they're strong enough to create all sorts of trouble and not strong enough to set things in order. So his top priority was get rid of the papacy, and his deepest, longest term was get rid of Catholic Christianity and replace it with an entirely new order.
So we are nearly at time, Chris. I just want to mention that Kendall Sharp, our incredible chair of the basic program of liberal education for adults, has put in the chat here the link for those of you who might be interested in being part of a full course on this topic with the eminent Chris Lynch. Let me just maybe make these power round questions because I'd love to get to them, but ask for your 30-second version answers, which is a terrible
Okay.
thing to ask, someone with your level of knowledge on these topics. Was Machiavelli in some way directly or indirectly influential on the American founders? The short version.
Yes, especially through Adams. Adams read Florentine Histories, wrote a commentary on it. Deep influence. Federalist 51, I'd say, really picks up on the core of Machiavelli.
And this is from Drew Phelps. Seems perfect to end on. What two nuggets from Machiavelli might we ponder on for today in the midst of change?
Oh, wow. I guess for the main thing that I would say with Machiavelli is keep your eyes open, and watch your own prejudices. He was, sort of ruthless with his own prejudices, made terrible fun of other people for clinging to theirs, and really tried to be able to see things as they are, because it's so much easier to fall back on some prefabbed ideology rather than use I said arms of your own are the main thing for him. Your chief, most fundamental arms, meaning weapons, is your mind, and really, having possession of it for yourself and not putting it in someone else's hands is what he's about. So that's the best thing I could say.
Well, a perfect ending for a university that prides itself on the life of the mind. And I'll just close by saying you mentioned this idea of Machiavelli as the serious, the politics, the war, and the love, and the more joyful. And this conversation has been both a joy and a profoundly insightful one. So thank you for all of the teaching that you do at the school, and thank you all for joining us to explore these topics further. Looking forward to seeing many of you again. And I'll just mention the topic that came up a few times today, which is overwhelming our world, Ukraine. We will have a webinar on that tomorrow at 11 a.m. You can see the details on our website. We'll be talking to a political scientist and a historian and trying to better understand where we are and how we could potentially move forward in our world from here. Thank you all. Looking forward to seeing many of you and continuing your learning experience here at Graham. Bye.